The latest reports from Eastern Europe paint a dramatic picture. Russia, once seen as a rising power under Vladimir Putin, now shows multiple signs of severe stress. Polls reveal that more than half of Russians say the war in Ukraine has hurt their daily lives. Even senior Kremlin officials are sounding alarms. Russia's economic development minister admitted the country is on the brink of a recession, with falling foreign reserves and surging budget deficits. Meanwhile, Ukraine is watching closely, hopeful that these troubles might turn the tide. In this video, we will examine the facts. We'll survey Russia's deepening economic woes, sanctions, inflation, oil dependence, the mood and unrest among ordinary Russians, the operational setbacks on the battlefield, and emerging fractures within the Russian leadership. We will then look at Ukraine's response, its strategy shifts and morale, as Ukrainians react to a potentially weakening neighbor. Our analysis stays grounded in the evidence, combining hard data with an emotionally resonant tone to explain what is happening now in this pivotal conflict. Russia's economy, propped up for decades by energy exports, is showing clear signs of strain. After the initial war economy boom, growth has stalled. In early 2025, even Finance Minister Reshetnikov was warning of recession. Inflation is now a major concern. Official figures put annual CPI around 10 to 15%, but many experts estimate real inflation at 15 to 24% or more. The central bank raised rates to about 21% by late 2024 to fight inflation. Meanwhile, Russians' nominal wages have hit record levels in rubles, but rising prices have eaten away gains. Only about 1 in 10 Russians say their finances have improved this year, while roughly 1 in 5 say things are worse, a sign that many feel squeezed by costs. Underlying fundamentals look weak. Russia faces a chronic labor shortage, roughly 2.7 million workers short, caused by emigration, demographic decline, and wartime losses. Businesses are in trouble. Bankruptcies jumped 26% year-on-year in early 2024 as high interest and inflation cripple companies. Household debt is rising and consumer demand is collapsing. The budget is under pressure. Authorities originally hoped to run a deficit of only 0.5% of GDP in 2025, but have had to revise it up to about 1.7%. This is partly because the government is spending massively on the military, consuming over 40% of the federal budget. Even with oil prices around $50 to $60 per barrel, every $10 drop in crude costs Russia about $17 billion in revenue. In 2024, hydrocarbon revenues still made up roughly 30% of the federal budget, so Russia remains very vulnerable to energy price swings. On the whole, many analysts conclude that Russia's war-driven economy is fragile. One commentator called it a house of cards, warning that the combination of sanctions and military spending has aggravated shortages and bankruptcies. With sovereign wealth reserves shrinking, the government has only about 4 trillion rubles left, roughly equal to the annual deficit. Russia may soon run low on buffers. Key economic indicators: budget deficit approximately 1.7% of GDP, up sharply, less than 4 trillion rubles left in reserves. Inflation and wages. Official inflation approximately 10 to 15%, likely higher in reality. Nominal wages up, but real purchasing power falling. Economic stress. Worker shortage approximately 2.7 million, corporate bankruptcies plus 26% in 2024. Resource dependency. Oil and gas revenue approximately 30% of budget. Energy price drops cut the budget by approximately 17 billion %, $10 decline. Expert warnings: some analysts liken Russia's situation to 1989 USSR. The war economy is deemed a house of cards. These factors, sanctions, inflation, and dwindling buffers, collectively point to serious economic instability in Russia by 2024 to 2025. As economic pressure mounts, public sentiment is shifting. Open protest in Russia is nearly impossible. Authorities routinely ban gatherings, yet some signs of discontent leak through. Human Rights Watch reports that in 2024, over 1,100 people were arrested at rallies, despite COVID restrictions being lifted. Spontaneous assemblies, for example, mourning or environmental rallies, are quickly dispersed by force. Russia's security services have also designated thousands of activists and NGOs as foreign agents to stifle criticism. Navalny's February 2024 death in prison was kept secret until days later, and even paying respects has become risky for citizens. Still, the fact that tens of thousands queued to bury him, often chanting anti-war slogans, shows that an anti-war undercurrent remains. Behind the scenes, independent surveys tell a similar story of war weariness. A late 2024 poll found 47% of Russians believe the Ukraine invasion has produced more harm than benefit for Russia. By early 2025, one survey reported 54% of Russians saying the war had negatively affected their lives, versus only 9% reporting any positive effect. Economic hardship is a big part of this. 36% of respondents in February 2025 said their personal financial situation had worsened in the past few months, up from 27% in September 2024. With inflation and longer working hours, many families struggle to maintain living standards. Consequently, priority opinions are shifting. Those rating defense spending as top priority fell from 43% to 36% between late 2024 and early 2025, while support for higher social spending rose. Still, society is divided. Roughly half of Russians, 52%, continue to support the invasion, down slightly from earlier highs, and debates over escalation versus diplomacy remain contentious. Anti-war sentiment. In late 2024, 47% of Russians said the war brought more harm than good. Even chants against the war broke through at events like Navalny's funeral. Daily life impact. February 2025 polls found 54% of Russians saying the Ukraine war hurt their lives, only 9% saying it helped. Economic pain. 36% reported worsening personal finances, up from 27%, with rising inflation and overtime work taking a toll. Shifting priorities. Those putting defense spending first fell to 36%, from 43%. More people now favor social programs as needs increase. Protests and crackdowns. Authorities barred most gatherings, even commemorating activists like Fail Alsanov led to violent police action. Yet around 500 people were detained after holding memorials for Navalny, reflecting both repression and resilience. In summary, while open dissent is suppressed, growing numbers of Russians privately express war fatigue and disillusionment. The surveys show a clear trend. The war's economic and social costs are reducing public support and raising questions, even if the regime still enforces silence. On the front lines in Ukraine, the Russian military is struggling to achieve decisive gains. Data from analysts show that since January 2024, Russia has captured only about 5,000 square kilometers of new territory, less than 1% of Ukraine, mainly in parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv. Incredibly slow advance rates, often only a few dozen meters per day, mean Ukraine's defenses have largely held in place. By contrast, Ukraine has managed counterattacks and regained substantial ground in previous years, so Russia's recent territorial gains are described as paltry. These limited gains have come at a staggering human and material cost for Russia. Open-source tallies estimate that, by mid-2025, roughly 250,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, with about 950,000 total casualties, killed or wounded. At the current rate, Russia could reach 1 million casualties by summer 2025, an extraordinary toll. Equipment losses are similarly severe. Since early 2024, Russia reportedly lost around 1,865 tanks and over 1,149 armored fighting vehicles, along with thousands of artillery pieces and support vehicles. These losses are significantly higher than Ukraine's, with estimates ranging from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1 in Ukraine's favor. Historian charts underscore the scale. Russia has lost more soldiers in Ukraine so far than in all post-World War II conflicts combined, and far more than during the Soviet-Afghan War or Chechen wars. Analysts point to several factors causing these problems: poor Russian operational coordination, supply issues, and the effective Ukrainian defense in depth using Western arms. As one study concluded, Russia's inability to coordinate firepower with maneuvering forces has led to repeated stalling. In simple terms, Russia's offensive is grinding down its own manpower with little strategic payoff. Some Western officials warn that without a sudden influx of manpower, for example, massive mobilization, Russia cannot sustain this attrition. Meanwhile, Ukraine's soldiers remain emboldened by Western aid. Even as talk of aid pauses arises, Europe and the US continue supplying weapons that blunt Russian attacks. Notably, Ukraine is now seeking creative ways to secure more advanced arms, for example, asking Europe to buy US systems for transfer. In summary, Russia's war effort is under severe strain. It holds little initiative on the battlefield and is suffering disproportionately high losses. Territory and momentum. Since January 2024, Russian forces have advanced only approximately 5,000 square kilometers, about 0.9% of Ukraine. Offensives often creep forward at only approximately 50 meters per day. Equipment losses. Russia has lost roughly 1,865 tanks, 1,149 infantry fighting vehicles, 300 artillery systems, and more since 2024, significantly more equipment than Ukraine. Casualties: around 950,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded, approximately 250,000 killed. At this rate, Russia could exceed 1 million total casualties by summer 2025, far above any other recent Russian-Soviet war. Operational issues. Analysts say poor coordination and Ukrainian defense have slowed Russia's advance to a crawl. Continued Western arms aid makes each defeat more costly for Moscow. These figures underline Russia's difficulties on the battlefield. Under the weight of sanctions, under-resourced offensives, and stiff resistance, Russia is paying a high price for very little ground. So far, the Kremlin's grip has not visibly cracked. Officially, Putin remains firmly in control. He easily won a 2024 election with no real opposition, but insiders note rising tensions among the elite. The 2023 mutiny led by Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin was a dramatic example. Heavy military equipment under Prigozhin's command actually marched toward Moscow before abruptly standing down. Analysts say this episode and Prigozhin's subsequent assassination exposed deep rivalry between the military high command and private armies. Such factionalism hints at an uneasy balance of power. Observers now describe Russia's ruling class as operating in survival mode, with Putin increasingly relying on reactive, tactical decision-making. In effect, Putin is like a load-bearing wall under the system, necessary for stability, but ironically the system holds together by constantly deferring to him. Meanwhile, the government's authoritarian machinery has tightened further. Laws against extremism and fake news are used to silence critics. Officials have labeled thousands as foreign agents. The death in prison of opposition figure Alexei Navalny in early 2024 was kept secret until it became public, and his funeral, where mourners defiantly chanted anti-war slogans, was closely monitored by police. These moves remind Russians that dissent carries great risk. Yet even from exile and prisons, opposition voices keep challenging the narrative. Notably, after years of propaganda, some polls still show substantial public openness to peace talks. In some, insiders may be fearful, but they have not coalesced into a united alternative leadership. The regime's core power structure, Siloviki, security services, loyal technocrats, remains largely intact. Still, analysts warn that if economic collapse forces dramatic budget cuts or popular unrest surges, the veneer of stability could crack. For now, Putin's circle is pushing forward, but the pressures are unmistakable. Putin's standing. He won his fifth term in a tightly controlled election. However, even close allies admit his day-to-day governance is often reactive and ambiguous. Elite tensions. The 2023 Wagner mutiny showed a rare public split between the military and paramilitaries. It suggests that key figures must now prove loyalty or face consequences. Opposition suppressed. Navalny's death in custody and the jailing of critics, for example, Kara-Murza, Orlov, underscore the lack of political plurality. Yet the turnout at his funeral, with anti-war chants, demonstrates that segments of society still resist the war narrative. Survival mode. Analysts say Russia's elites are anxious. Promotion and arrest are unpredictable. Putin is seen as the system's guarantor, but this stability is tenuous. External commentators warn that if Russia's economy truly collapses, the regime itself could face a crisis of legitimacy. In effect, the Russian leadership is under unprecedented stress. So far, it has weathered the storm through repression and control, but observers note that political decision-making has become more about crisis management than vision. The crucial question is whether these elite fissures can be managed behind closed doors, or whether they will surface if conditions worsen. In Ukraine, the talk is very different. Ukrainian society remains remarkably resilient despite immense suffering. 3 years into the war, Ukrainians continue to rally around the flag. Polls in early 2025 showed President Zelensky's approval actually rising, with roughly 57 to 65% of respondents expressing trust in his leadership, depending on the poll. Ukrainians are fighting for their existence. About 71% say they are optimistic about Ukraine's future, and 69% believe they could repel another Russian offensive. The Ukrainian army is the most trusted institution in the country, seen by many as the key source of hope. In short, rather than panic at Russia's troubles, Ukraine's population appears emboldened and determined to hold the line. Strategically, Kyiv is adapting to both its own challenges and Russia's. Recently, Ukraine's government was reshuffled, including a new prime minister and defense minister, with an explicit focus on war needs. The new leaders have vowed to increase domestic arms production. For example, plans call for boosting locally made weapons from about 40% to 50% of Ukraine's total within months. This build-it-at-home approach aims to reduce dependency on foreign supplies. At the international level, Ukraine has been pushing its allies to sustain and even increase support, even as the US briefly threatened to condition aid on negotiations. European countries, for instance, are exploring ways to purchase additional American weapons for Ukraine and have committed billions to Ukraine's defense industry. In fact, by mid-2025, the EU had published its first strategic document explicitly naming support for Ukraine's defense as a priority, backing a so-called porcupine strategy of fortifying Ukraine's ability to resist any future invasion. Morale in Ukraine remains high. By understanding Russia as an existential threat, backed by memories of Crimea 2014 and full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukrainians of all backgrounds feel united in resistance. President Zelensky, despite Western pressure, enjoys broad trust at home. Ukrainians even discuss planning for long-term struggle. Analysts have noted a shift to strategic neutralization, meaning the goal is to render any Russian aggression pointless by continuously degrading its capacity. All this reflects a country determined to defend itself, with its people active engagement in war production and civil defense increasing daily. In the eyes of many Ukrainians, Russia's difficulties only strengthen their resolve. Public resolve. Roughly 57 to 65% of Ukrainians trusted Zelensky in early 2025. 71% feel optimistic about Ukraine's future. National unity. A majority regard Russia as an existential threat, reinforcing broad support for the military effort. Government action. Ukraine's July 2025 government shakeup prioritized weapons production. Leaders pledged to increase domestically made arms from 40% to 50% of total supply. Allied support. Europe has stepped up, pledging billions for Ukraine's defense industry and endorsing plans, the Steel Porcupine strategy, to make Ukraine too well defended to conquer. Armed forces as hope. Polls show the Ukrainian military is the most trusted institution, viewed as central to survival and post-war recovery. In short, Ukrainians seem galvanized by Russia's troubles. Their leadership is keenly aware that the current moment offers both opportunities, momentum, more aid if Russia weakens, and dangers, potential talks under pressure. But for now, the people's morale is strong. As one Ukrainian analyst put it, the choice for Ukrainians is stark: continue fighting for independence or risk subjugation to a regime they overwhelmingly reject. The trend so far is clear: Ukraine's society, battered but unbroken, is preparing to persevere. The situation at mid-2025 is unprecedented. Russia faces what experts call a perfect storm: deepening sanctions, a war that is grinding on without clear gains, and growing dissatisfaction among its people. These factors threaten to push Russia into recession and put enormous strain on Putin's regime. Ukraine, by contrast, remains focused on survival and victory. Its people are hopeful, its military still holds the front, and its government is rapidly adjusting to long-term defense needs. It would be premature to declare a full collapse of Russia. History has shown that authoritarian regimes can endure immense stress, and official propaganda still finds support among many Russians. Nevertheless, the indicators are stark and concerning. Whatever happens next will have profound consequences for millions of lives in Eastern Europe and for global security. One thing is certain: we are witnessing a pivotal moment. Russia's future trajectory, and Ukraine's, hinge on how these economic, social, and military pressures play out in the months ahead. We will continue to follow the facts closely. Thank you for watching this analysis, and we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below.